Well, let's keep you up to speed on the Russian war in Ukraine. Poland's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki says that fighters from Russia's private Wagner mercenary force have been moved closer to NATO's eastern flank to stabilize the military alliance. Wagner soldiers have begun training in the Belarus National Army, prompting Poland to start moving more than 1,000 troops closer to the border. On Tuesday this week, it accused Belarus of violating its airspace and military helicopters. The politicians met in the Gap, a sparsely populated area but strategically important area of the Polish territory between Belarus and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which joins the Baltic states to other NATO members. Away in Ukraine now, where soldiers have been discovering bodies of Russian troops at an abandoned position. The soldiers were clearing landmines. They said they couldn't see two guys lying on each other and later discovered that they were killed by landmines. Occupying Russian troops have sworn landmines and booby traps across hundreds of miles of Ukraine's front, a tactic that Kiev's commanders have described as the primary reason why their long-awaited summer counteroffensive has slowed to a crawl. For mine clearers, every day brings deadly risks, trying to make the ground safe, first for their fellow soldiers to advance and eventually for civilians to go home. Alexandra, who's an anesthesiologist, was with 128th Brigade, who treats battlefield wounds at the Frontline Field Hospital, says the landmine inflicted wounds and a colossal toll in the first month of the counteroffensive launched in the month of June. Since the mines forced commanders to slow this advance, the number of wounded arriving at his hospital has now tapered off remarkably, but the sappers are still getting killed. Ukraine's factories have tooled up to make equipment to help keep the sappers safer. In addition to this, to the kitten hooks, Volodymir's unit has now been sent spider boots, which lifts each foot off the ground on 4 metal legs so that any blast they set off will not be triggered directly under the sapper's body. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed that Russia's attack on port infrastructure showing Moscow's intent on creating a global catastrophe with a crisis of food markets, prices and supplies. In his nightly video address, President Zelensky says for the Russian state, it is not just a battle against Ukraine's freedom and against the country. Moscow, he says, is waging a battle for a global catastrophe. In its madness, it needs worldly food markets to collapse. They need a price crisis. They need disruptions in supplies. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president has also said that he hopes the Ukraine Peace Summit could go this autumn and that this week's talks in Saudi Arabia are a stepping stone towards this goal. President Zelensky was speaking to diplomats in a speech published on the president's website that almost 40 countries will be represented at the meeting in Jeddah on August the 5th and the 6th. Mr. Zelensky and his team are now working with allies to build broad support for a peace summit that will endorse principles to underpin a settlement to end the war started by Russia's full-scale invasion almost 18 months ago. His vision for peace calls for the full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and a full withdrawal of Russian troops, the protection of food and energy security, nuclear safety, the release of all prisoners, and other points. And in another development, the Russian Air Force has held nighttime military drills with Syrian special force units. Footage released by the ministry showed the drills involved military planes, helicopters, and multiple missile launch systems, as well as a large amount of infantry and other military hardware. Russia intervened in Syria's conflict back in 2015, using airstrikes and deploying advisors and military police to help Syrian President Bashar al-Assad retake his territory from rebels. Meanwhile, jailed Russian opposition leader and prominent Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny is to appear in court on Friday to face a verdict that could hand him a fresh sentence of 2 decades in prison. Earlier, Russia's state prosecutors requested he'd be given a 20-year sentence following charges that include extremism. Navalny has been on trial since late June behind closed doors at the IK6 penal colony in Melakovo, and that's about 235 kilometers east of Moscow, where he is already serving sentence totaling 11.5 years on fraud and other charges that he says were trumped up to silence him. President Vladimir Putin's most prominent and vocal opponents face a grab bag on new charges, which he now says are similarly fabricated to keep him out of the political life. But court records are showing they relate to 6 different articles of the Russian Criminal Code, including inciting and financing extremist activities and creating an extremist organization. Russia has outlawed Navalny's campaign organization as part of a crackdown on dissent that started well before the conflict in Ukraine and has intensified in nearly 17 months since it started.